Hello, and welcome to today's webinar for mental health professionals, Keeping Imposter Syndrome at Bay, using social media and other creative tools to build mentorship and confidence as an early career professional with Dr. Emily Billick. My name is Astrid Masvar. I am the Senior Coordinator for Education and Outreach. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot for an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please mute your audio so we do not hear any background noise. To mute yourself, please use the grab tab circled in the red in the attendee interface. Please also disable your webcam by clicking on the webcam icon below the audio button. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat box of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would now like to introduce Emily Billick. Emily Billick is a clinical psychologist and a clinical assistant professor in the University of Michigan Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Billick splits her time between clinical work, supervision and training, clinical research, and outreach. Her clinical and research interests center around evidence-based treatments for pediatric emotional disorders. Dr. Billick is committed to outreach and has given numerous talks to graduate and undergraduate students on the topics of imposter syndrome, dissertation stress reduction, and test anxiety. She also serves as the chair of the ABCT Social Networking Media Committee and was previously the co-chair of the ADAA Early Career Special Interest Group. I'm now going to take a moment to pass the screen to our expert. There will be a brief pause while I do so.
All right, I hope everyone can see and hear me okay. Welcome. Again, my name is Emily Billick, and today we'll be talking about imposter syndrome, how we can, oh good, I just got a message that you guys can hear me, great. Okay, so we're gonna talk about imposter syndrome, what it looks like, who it affects, what the consequences of it are if we leave it unchecked. And then we'll talk about some strategies for overcoming imposter syndrome. And we're going to have a special emphasis today on using Twitter specifically, social media in general, but Twitter specifically to gain mentorship and connection online and to really help overcome imposter syndrome. I wonder if I can make this go away. I don't know if you guys can see the bottom of the screen. All right. I don't know how to, so we're just going to move forward. Okay, that looks better. I have nothing to disclose. All right, so imposter syndrome, it's a pretty sexy topic. It is in the news all the time. You can always find lots of articles about it. Here are some that I found that are just from the last month. There are lots. So these are not all of them. So why would we have a whole webinar on imposter syndrome when you can just Google it online? I guess you probably know the answer to that. It's similar to any pop psychology topic. We don't really know what we're getting. People like to talk about imposter syndrome. They may or may not have helpful advice about it. So for myself, I've found that looking at imposter syndrome and difficulties with confidence or with competence early in my career, looking at it through a cognitive behavioral lens, I found that to be very, very helpful. So I'm hoping that we can zoom out from the noise and the hype of imposter syndrome and look at imposter syndrome from a cognitive behavioral perspective today, and hopefully that will resonate with some of you guys as well. So I think about imposter syndrome as being somewhere along this confidence spectrum. All the way to the left, we have very, very low confidence in your abilities, lower self-assurance than your knowledge base. Your skills are higher than your own confidence in your skills. And then all the way on the other side, we have the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is where your self-assurance is much beyond your knowledge base. You feel as though you're an expert in something where you have a lot more to learn. The example I like to think of for this is when I came home from college, my first semester, I had just taken my first philosophy course, and suddenly I felt like I was the foremost expert in Kierkegaard and Kant and all things philosophy. And I cringe when I think about it now, because obviously I had just barely scratched the surface of knowledge about philosophy and don't consider myself an expert in philosophy at all at this point. I think that's a very common presentation of Dunning-Kruger, because it's when you just start to learn about something, you know nothing about it, you get a little bit of knowledge, oh my gosh, I have so much to offer, I have so much to share. But usually this is the time when we know less than we feel confident in. So as with many things, the healthy balance is in the middle, and we want to find a way to have our self-assurance and confidence more or less map on to our actual knowledge and expertise level. This is where you have confidence in your abilities, but you know that you don't know everything, and you're willing to seek out additional help to grow in the areas that you still need to grow. So looking at this, I want you to take a moment to kind of rate yourself internally on where you fall. Are you a fraud, thinking that this talk is just perfect, it's so about you? Are you somewhere in the middle, thinking that your mistakes balance out how awesome you are? You're not sure, you don't know what you don't know yet? Or is Beyonce just a mere plebeian? She should be your own backup dancer. So obviously, I hope that you fall in the center, that your mistakes balance out your awesomeness, but that might make this talk less helpful to you, because we're really going to focus on people on the far side of this spectrum, people who feel like frauds. We'll talk about this later, especially if anyone has questions about it towards the end, but I get questions when I give similar talks sometimes about like, well, what if I'm a fraud and I don't know it? What if I actually have Dunning-Kruger effect? What if I think I'm too good and really I'm just a fraud? So the answer to your question is in your question. If you think that you're a fraud, you're falling on the left-hand side. People who are worried that they have Dunning-Kruger effect do not have Dunning-Kruger effect. All right, moving on. So imposter syndrome. And you may notice parallels throughout this talk to how we talk to our patients with anxiety. It's a very similar type of concern. So just like anxiety, imposter syndrome is normal, and it's quite common, especially among early career professionals, graduate students, people who are from underrepresented groups, so often women, people of color, minorities of other type. They are more likely to feel like a fish out of water and then start to compare their own feelings of inadequacy to other people's reflected glory, right? And those are situations where we're most likely to feel imposter syndrome. But the downside is that even with experience and accolades, often imposter syndrome does not go away on its own for reasons we'll talk about later. So that can be discouraging, because you might want to think like, okay, well, if I just get a little bit further in my career, once I just know a little bit more, this imposter syndrome is going to melt away. And it often doesn't. But that's sort of the nature of imposter syndrome. It's a false alarm. It's telling us that we know less than we do. So the more that you learn, it's not going to counteract it. Just as a side note, you'll note throughout the talk that I will be sharing tweets that may be relevant to content that we're discussing. This will make more sense when we talk about how to use Twitter to overcome imposter syndrome and other early career difficulties. But yeah, just wanted to note that as we go. All right, so these are some common beliefs about imposter syndrome. One thing I hear a lot is that if I get rid of my imposter syndrome, I'll never be motivated to try. Or another way of looking at this question is, my imposter syndrome is the only reason that I'm successful. Related, I mentioned before some articles in the news. So I came across an article, not from the last month, but from 2015 by a woman named Molly Fisher. And her article was entitled, "I hope I never get over my imposter syndrome." And the quote from that article is, "The heart-clenching dread of imposter syndrome is basically the only thing that gets me through. What would I do if I weren't afraid? Probably nothing." So it's this commonly held belief that imposter syndrome equals ambition, that if we didn't feel like a fraud all the time, we would not be motivated to try. So what do we think? Is that true or false? I'm sure you can guess that I think it's false, that imposter syndrome does not equal our ambition, and equating self-worth with success is where we get into trouble. This is where we start to experience those feelings of dread and doubt about our abilities. And sure, maybe that does push us in some ways to work hard, but it's not often the sort of fulfilling and meaningful feeling of work that we get from when we are able to separate our success and self-worth and say, I am a valuable person, regardless of whether I succeed in this one area. But this is an area that's important to me, so I am motivated to try. One thing that I tell people is, well, and this is, again, it's something that I talk to my patients about too, like, especially patients with perfectionism. They'll tell me, I couldn't be successful. I would never have achieved everything that I've achieved if I didn't hold these unreasonable, impossible standards for myself. And okay, maybe holding high standards does motivate, but maybe it is your own anchor holding you back. So what if I've been successful up till now despite my perfectionism or in spite of my imposter syndrome? And I recently reflected on this strategy and was thinking that for about 50% of my patients or 50% of people that I talk to about this, it's like a mind blown moment, like, whoa, what if that's true? What if I should just get rid of my imposter syndrome and then I could even be more successful? And the other half of people look at me like I'm crazy. So I expect that reaction. You may hold very tightly to that belief that imposter syndrome or perfectionism is getting you where you got. But I'm going to argue the opposite, that you can have ambition and have a lot of success in your career without feeding the shame that comes with imposter syndrome. So that's not to say you're going to get rid of all self-doubt, but we don't have to feed it. Another commonly held belief is that imposter syndrome probably means that you care a lot about this goal. Again, just a slight pivot from what we might say about anxiety. Of course, anxiety and doubt often grab hold of the things we care about most. That just shows that it's something you care about, right? So an example would be if you didn't really care about being late, if that's not a value that you hold, you're probably not going to be too anxious when you are late. But things that are important to you that identify with your values, those are going to be things that may be more vulnerable to anxiety and self-doubt. However, that doesn't mean we have to feed that, right? There are more adaptive ways to channel your passion for your career through the avoidance and downshifting and things that we'll talk about later. All right, so moving along, let's talk about the imposter cycle. This is actually a model that I found online from a Hustle article a few years ago, and I really like it, so I thought we could use it today in today's talk. So imagine that you can think of something in your career or in grad school for you that tends to provoke a lot of this feeling of inadequacy and self-doubt. A common one is having to give a talk. So imagine that you're giving whatever your scenario is, but I'll talk through the idea of giving a talk to colleagues or to trainees or to people even superior to you. So you're assigned this. Now there's a choice point here, right? You're given the opportunity to give a talk. You often have the opportunity to turn it down. And that is called downshifting, and we'll talk more about that later. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you have agreed to give the talk. That's going to likely, especially with imposter syndrome, it's going to flare up this anxiety, the self-doubt, worry, questions of, do I have anything to offer? Everyone's going to find out that I know nothing about this topic. Maybe everyone will think that they have more to say about it, especially if you're giving a talk to trainees. Maybe they'll think that you're a fraud and you don't deserve to be where you are in your career. Just think about what the thoughts might be for you. Certainly, those feelings are uncomfortable and they can provoke anxiety-driven behaviors. Obviously, as we often talk about with patients, there's the avoidance option. And in this situation, that might be procrastination. Let me put off working on it because anytime I think about it, those thoughts and those feelings, they're intolerable. I have to put it away, put it to the side. Alternatively, there's the over-preparation model of, oh my gosh, I've got to work so hard because I am not personally worthy of this task. So I've got to put in extra effort to compensate. And I hope you don't read in too much to this from this talk, but certainly people who spend lots and lots of time on the minutia, lots of animations perchance, maybe they are, you're working too hard to overcompensate for the content, which is what matters, right? Okay, so then in those moments, when you over-prepare or you procrastinate, you get that sense of relief, right? Oh, I don't have to feel that anxiety right now, or at least I don't have to feel the full effects of that anxiety at this moment. And then you give the talk, right? So the moment comes, you somehow have managed to not avoid it entirely, you didn't call in sick, you're giving the talk, and during it, this is when you experience a lot of biased attention. Of course, biased attention can happen any point in our cycle, but let's focus on it during the event in question. So you're in the middle of giving the talk. Again, this is very similar, right? It maps right onto a social anxiety situation of giving a presentation. The focus of the negative thoughts are a little bit different. I'm a fraud. Where do you spend your attention during the talk? Are you focusing on what everyone in the crowd is doing? And where are you looking at the neutral, negative, or positive stimuli and information? So if you focus all of your attention and zoom in, as our brains are wont to do, zoom in on the people who are giving negative feedback. Maybe they're staring at their computers or their phone, they're drifting off to sleep during your talk. Oh my gosh, all this evidence and information that you are a fraud, you don't deserve to be there. There's probably also neutral or positive information in the same setting, people who are nodding along, minimally engaged to very engaged. If you focus your attention there, you might have a very different experience. And then there's the self-focused attention too, right? Oh my gosh, my heart is racing, I have butterflies in my stomach, my mouth is dry, my mind keeps going blank, I keep stumbling over my words. So certainly that's going to make you have more negative thoughts and feel worse. But importantly, also, it means you're not focusing on the content, and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy because now the content isn't as good because you are so focused on all these other pieces of information. But either way, somehow you get through the talk, hopefully alive. And what do? So this is where we get to this ignore, push away positive feedback again. So now you're done with the talk, you have the opportunity to get some feedback probably, right? Stick around, see your friends, have them tell you what a great job you did, or also, unfortunately, have the possibility that someone could say something negative. So with the imposter syndrome might urge you to leave the setting very quickly, to avoid any opportunities for feedback because you're worried it will be negative. You don't, if you're a fraud, you don't want to hear it from anyone else. But even if you do give yourself an opportunity to hear positive feedback, there's obviously that opportunity to ignore it as well, to treat it as, oh, they're just lying to me, right? With social situations, we never know for sure if someone's telling us the truth. So we can always interpret it through our negative imposter syndrome lens that everyone is just lying to me. Or, you know, it can be a slight shift of like, oh, wow, that's a lot of positive feedback. They must have thought that I wasn't up for this task. So they're just shocked that I did a passable job. And even though that's positive feedback, you're still interpreting it through the imposter syndrome lens in a way that's going to feed those feelings of being a fake, a self-doubt, ongoing depression and anxiety. And of course, you know, as we know, then the next time you're offered an opportunity to do something outside of your comfort zone, you may be more likely to experience the self-doubt and anxiety, and again, potentially downshift. So that brings us to what happens if we don't do anything about this imposter syndrome. If we just assume, well, the more advanced I get, the less imposter syndrome I'm going to have. Well, the dangers of that are that it can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, right? As we've talked a little bit about. If you feel a lot of doubt about yourself, you're not going to seek out opportunities to kind of push yourself. I mean, it's natural early in graduate school, in your career, you're on a growth curve, right? You're going to make mistakes. And so it's important to push yourself through those mistakes, to push yourself to experience new things so that you can hit the next level in your career and growth. If you don't take those opportunities, you're not going to grow, you're not going to get better at your work, and then it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy if you don't know maybe as much as you should in your career. So you need to push yourself outside of that comfort zone in order to grow. Also, isolation. If we don't seek feedback, if we don't open ourselves up to talking to other colleagues, if we're so afraid of being found out as a fraud, we're never vulnerable, or never spend time with our colleagues because then we're afraid of having comparison. Wow, look at how well they're doing in all of their tasks and research or clinical work or trainings, whatever, and I'm the only fraud. And that leads you to feeling alone, not having that connection and mentorship that you might need early in your career. And it can also just make you feel like you're the only person who feels that way. And as we've talked a little bit about as well, the downshifting of not taking on new opportunities, turning down opportunities, staying within that little bubble of what you feel like you know how to do, which of course we know leads to us feeling pretty dissatisfied in our careers long term. So as with any good CBT model, we can look at the biased attention and the negative automatic thoughts. We can look at the avoidance piece, and we can learn new strategies for fighting back against those unhelpful behaviors. And then what we'll talk about here is the isolation, the self-fulfilling prophecies, the downshifting, that whether or not you have full-blown imposter syndrome are very, very common as a student or early career professional. We're going to talk about some new ways of fighting back against that, regardless of whether you find yourself really stuck in imposter syndrome. And it may or may not be comfortable to some people to use social media to do that. I'm going to emphasize Twitter today because that's especially what I have used and found helpful for connection and professional growth. But there are other social media outlets you could use as well. So I'm sure everyone is super familiar with cognitive restructuring. I'm not going to go into that very much here, but obviously what you want to do is identify biased attention, negative interpretations that you hold, and look for more accurate or helpful reframes. Don't feed the negative, unhelpful thoughts. What about approach? What can you do to approach when you want to avoid, procrastinate, or over-prepare? So one phrase I love is do things before you feel ready. And this is something that I have really tried to embrace in my own career because there are lots of tasks that I never feel ready to do. Writing is often one of them because if you wait for the motivation or the great aha moment, I feel like I will be waiting forever. There's lots of ways to do things before you feel ready, but one strategy or tool that I've used that I found really, really helpful is something called the Pomodoro method. Pomodoro means tomato in Spanish, and I guess there are tomato timers, otherwise I don't really know why it would be called this, but essentially you find any kind of timer. You can use a timer on your phone or whatever, but they also have nice web tools as well that you set the length of the work period and the length of the break period. Usually it's about 25 minutes of work, 5-minute break. And during that work period, you do nothing but work. And usually, again, for me, this is writing a difficult project or task, or even if it's like writing a report for clinical work that I've been avoiding. And when I turn, usually the way I use this is almost as a free write session. When I turn that 25 minutes on, I just write. I try to close all of my other windows. I do not use the internet. Even if there are research things that I need to do, I try to just write for those 25 minutes because, and maybe this is unique, but I find that as soon as I get onto the internet to research something, it's a very, very long time before I'm back to the topic. Research as avoidance is definitely something that I fall prey to. So doing free writes helps me a lot break through that feeling of a motivation. And oftentimes once I start writing and working on something, the motivation follows. I'll just say that Pomodoro is actually a technique that I learned about on Twitter. So it all comes full circle. But the other thing, the way that I've been using it lately is I've been, and the way that my imposter syndrome has been playing out for me lately is I've been working on board certification application, and there's a lot of written materials that go into that. And every time I go to work on it, I try to set aside time on Fridays. Every time I go to work on it, I'm filled with all the imposter syndrome thoughts of like, oh, they're going to turn me away. Who am I to deserve to be board certified? All those common thoughts. And if I sit there and feed those thoughts, I don't get any writing done. So, I'll turn on the timer, or I'll just be really strict with myself and say, now it's writing time. And if I just free write, suddenly I have a lot more written than I expected, or knowledge about something than I expected to. So it goes pretty well. So that's one strategy for doing things before you feel ready. Acting as if you are competent. So maybe we tell our patients a lot, what would you do if you weren't afraid? I thought it was a nice little pivot again to say, what would you do if you weren't a fraud? I think it's extra tricky for students and early career professionals because we get conflicting advice all the time. There are people who say, well, just make sure you say yes. If you say yes to things, then you'll get better at things, and then you'll have opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's all of the really important advice about work-life balance. Well, you have to learn how to say no. It's okay to say no. But then when do you say yes and when do you say no? I mean, I think it's very confusing. And what I use is like, what's the function of the behavior? When I want to say yes or no, what's the function of that, right? Is it because I want to say yes because, oh my gosh, this is going to build my career, or this is something I value a lot? Then that's a good thing to say yes to. If it's something that I want to say yes to because I feel like I am incompetent and I need to prove to everyone that I'm a valuable team member, usually these are things that actually don't promote something that helpful. So maybe it's like offering to take notes during a meeting. That reminds people that I'm part of the team, but doesn't contribute that much above and beyond what is needed to be done. I'm not saying you always say no to, to taking notes during a meeting. Good service is important. But if those are the only things you're saying yes to, that's problematic. And maybe if you felt like, hey, if I weren't a fraud, if I were competent in this area, I wouldn't always be saying yes to this thing because I would view my contributions, there are other ways to contribute that might be important ways to spend my time. And then finally, embracing failure, that age-old advice that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I think we're getting more and more people embracing this idea of like, let's pursue failure. Let's look for opportunities to fail. Apply for grants you don't expect to get, or apply to do a training that you might expect someone to turn down, especially with job applications or promotion applications. I hear students tell me all the time, like, oh, I'm not going to be competitive for this. And we know that that's a really common thing for imposter syndrome, for women, for minorities, to not apply for things that they are underqualified for. And then other populations do apply for those. And even if they are underqualified, they sometimes get it. So pursue rejection. You will still get rejected, but sometimes you might succeed. And all of these are really, really hard pieces of advice to follow, but I think they are satisfying when you do them. All right, so now let's talk about social media. So again, the pitfalls of imposter syndrome, or even of early career difficulties just in general. You can feel isolated. We've talked about that already. You feel disconnected. Maybe you are in a department where, or in a setting where no one really shares your experience, or maybe you're not allowing yourself to talk to people who share your experiences. So then you're just feeling alone. You may have lack of mentorship because you're not asking for mentorship because you don't want anyone to find out that you are a fraud. And like we've talked about, not feeling motivated, especially if you keep downshifting, not taking on opportunities, then you're stuck in these experiences that are no longer exciting or novel. So what can social media add? And again, specifically Twitter. There's a big normalization component. You get to talk to other people who have similar experiences, people at all ranges of their career, because again, feeling like a fraud doesn't always go away. And I just want to remind you that feeling like a fraud doesn't mean you have imposter syndrome. That's a very, very normal thing. It's how you feed it. And if we get stuck in those downshifting pitfalls, that's where it becomes a problem. On Twitter, you can find connection and mentorship, get advice on how to deal with imposter syndrome, but also on other aspects of your career, and it can actually lead to opportunities for career development. So this is where that's it. No, I'm just kidding. Let's show some examples of how it could actually do that. All right, so normalization. The coolest thing about Twitter, in my experience, is that there are experts on everything. You can find someone who is an expert in every field. That can be also quite intimidating, right? Especially for people who feel like frauds. So you have to learn to use it effectively to your own needs, and you have to know where to look and make sure you don't have biased attention, only focusing on people's successes. I think better than some other components of social media, where sometimes people really focus on just showing their best selves, like Instagram, I found that on Twitter, people really show the whole range of their struggles to their successes to their boring days and what they ate for lunch. So we have to filter out some of the unhelpful stuff and find the helpful stuff. Stephen Shaw is, I would say, an expert in his field, but he has days where he feels like an imposter as well. So there's this normalization component that you can find on Twitter. I've also developed friends through Twitter. So Kevin Chapman and Mary Alvord are both people who I only ever interacted with first on Twitter. So zooming back out, going back in time, when I first joined Twitter, I followed a bunch of people in the field who I did not know personally, but I knew were doing awesome work, or I found out about through Twitter because of people that I followed, who they followed, et cetera. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But these are two people that I followed early on, and despite my own feelings of inadequacy, I reached out to them, I responded to their tweets, I asked them questions, and over time, collegiality developed. I do not know, I had never met either of these people in real life, and then through conferences, we would start to meet in person, and now they're people I seek out at every conference when they're there so that we can take a selfie together, but also just chat. So I think that's just been so valuable and fun, and they are not certainly the only people that this has happened to, but it's they're not people I would otherwise know likely. Mentorship. I've mentioned a couple times now that I'm working on my board application. Certainly, it's clearly something that causes me a little bit of anxiety. So sometimes I reach out on Twitter about the fact that it's stressful, and unsolicited, I have gotten feedback from people who are more senior than me, who have board certification, offering to help. I mean, I think that was such an unexpected happy surprise. Certainly, you can request mentorship, you can get to know some people, you can ask them questions, but the fact that people were willing to offer me help, I mean, that meant a lot to me and means a lot to me as a part of a community that I get to be online. And again, like I said, you can find advice specifically for fighting imposter syndrome, or more broadly for fighting things like imposter syndrome, on Twitter. So M. Roy, she is an artist who is not in academia or in clinical psychology in any way, shape, or form, just someone who promotes a lot of positive coping through her art. And sometimes I print these out for my patients, but sometimes I have to use them for myself as well. So she really promotes this idea of doing things before you feel ready. Other people who are graduate students, maybe not in the clinical psych area, I should mention that there's a very, very active academic Twitter, which just is across the broad spectrum of academia, of higher education. So you can find people who are studying very different things than you, who are experiencing similar struggles, because in some ways it's a universal experience to feel incompetent. So I'll follow them, and I'll get, and I would say I get people talking about normalizing imposter syndrome or feeling uncertain in my feed. That happens at least once a week. So these are just a few of the ones that I pulled. Some people who may even be listening to this webinar are some people that I look up to for advice, and provide a lot of good reminders of how to stay the course with feeding the good thoughts and not succumbing to the imposter syndrome. So there's lots of different advice that you can find on Twitter. It's often very helpful. And then, of course, like I said, career development. So I've learned about a lot of resources through Twitter. I've gotten stats advice, both through requesting stats advice, but also just through the people that I follow providing links to helpful resources. This is a really cool website, by the way, that shows you a visualization of how to interpret confidence intervals. So if you are a student that struggles with this, or if you teach students who struggle with it, I highly recommend it. Found it through someone online. Writing advice. So Raul Pacheco Vega, I think he's a political science professor, but he provides a ton of mentorship online to mostly to students, but also early career professionals on how to write. He has some pretty impressive and crazy techniques. I think he wakes up every morning at 4 a.m. to work, and then takes a nap every afternoon. So that may not be everyone's style, but it has certainly given me some ideas for how I can break out of the mold of what I think is the way to work, and the right way to be a student or a professional, and find other ways to be productive for myself, what works for me. And Dr. Shaw, who I referenced earlier, he has a blog that is entitled How Not to Suck in Graduate School, with lots of different topics that he blogs about, usually about once a month, I think. So he brings humor, but also really great advice for how to cope with the difficult things in graduate school, which we all know is a highly stressful time that is just prone to feeling incompetent. And then most recently, I saw this tweet go viral of grant writing tips, pitfalls that someone had seen for people applying for K awards in his 5 years on a study section. So you have to struggle to read some of those, but I just thought that that was really cool, a really cool way to disseminate advice and a really cool way to receive it. Not someone who I would, actually he is at the University of Michigan, but not in my field. So not someone who I would otherwise probably interact with or get this advice from. And it was very cool to just see it show up in my feed. So all that said, how do you do Twitter? Maybe some of you already use it as a method for getting news, for keeping in contact with friends, for learning about celebrity culture, or maybe some of you use it a little bit professionally as well. Here are the things that I recommend for using it to help combat the imposter syndrome. Connect. This is the big one that is your imposter syndrome is say, oh no, I can't tweet that person. They're too big a deal, right? It's like going to a conference and seeing your conference idol there and not wanting to go up and introduce yourself. You should do both of those things. On Twitter, you can do it all year round. That doesn't mean that they will always respond. It doesn't mean that they will always be super helpful people, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So reach out, make connections, be engaged, respond to questions, ask questions, do many things, to interact with people on Twitter. But what if you're just starting out? It's helpful to figure out what is your niche, what are the things you're interested in. So here are some hashtags that I find helpful. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of CBT, so I follow CBT Works. For academic writing advice, I follow ACRI. And obviously, when you go to a good conference, you want to follow the hashtag. If you're not going, that makes sense because then you can follow along as people live tweet. But if you are there, it's great. It's a good way to find people that you like already on Twitter and get to meet them in person. Oh, that they're at that talk. Maybe I'll go introduce myself. It's a good way to find out about interesting talks that maybe you hadn't circled in your program that you do want to go to. Venture beyond your bubble. So again, on Twitter, there's an expert in everything, and a great way that I have found to learn about things is to get away from my echo chamber, get away from the people who only talk about the stuff that I already do. So one thing that I've really liked is this account called Real Scientists. Each week, a different scientist from any discipline, from anywhere in the world, takes over the account and tweets. And I haven't checked recently how many followers they have, but many, many people tune in and they tweet about their own discipline. They tweet about their own career development issues or their personal lives. And it's a way that I've learned a lot about areas of science that I had very little experience with before. And it's a way that I have connected with people about common experiences in the science and academic world, regardless of what discipline you're in. Here's one of the ones where you have to be a little bit cautious. Like I said, some of you may already have Twitter or an account. You have to think about how much personal info to share. If you're a clinician and you see patients, if you're not private on Twitter, it's possible that they could find you. So I've gone back and forth with how much personal information I want to share or whether I want to be private or public. Currently, I like it to be public because I think that it serves a dissemination value for me, and it also allows me to reach a wider audience. But there's been other times in my life where I haven't felt as comfortable with that. So for now, I try and keep the tweets that I tweet and the people that I interact with, I try and keep it as much as sort of like a neutral to professional level, and that has pros and cons. The other thing, again, it goes along with engage, promote your colleagues. So Dr. Pacheco that I talked about before, he started a hashtag a while ago now called Scholar Sunday, and on Sundays, he and other people promote other colleagues, and they can be people who are more junior to them to help them get further in their career, or more senior to them to help sort of thank people who have helped you along the way. I think both of those are really helpful. I like it because it's a good way for me to learn about other people I might not know about, so I can follow them, and that I can give back a little bit and thank people who've helped me in my, sort of in my growing my community on Twitter. What should you not do? Just like any social media platform, there are downsides. So we're talking today about how to use this to develop professionally to approach rather than avoid, to be productive. So certainly Twitter can be a tool for good or evil, and it can definitely fuel avoidance, procrastination, and unproductivity. So think about it, use it during your 5-minute break on Pomodoro, use it in the morning, use it in the evening, when you're not hoping to work, or just know what you're vulnerable to. Similarly, just like any social media platform, people tend to, like, there's an echo chamber effect. People tend to comment on political posts with really horrible vitriol. You have to be very careful about falling down the hole. I can't tell you the number of times I've told myself I'm not going to read the comments. I'm not going to go below one of these posts and get really sucked in. And then 5 minutes later, I'm down the rabbit hole and thinking to myself, shoot, I did it again. So it happens to the best of us. Just remember that that's a danger of Twitter. It's especially, I think, for whatever reason, it's especially vulnerable to people escalating their views on one or the other side because you want, I mean, there's this whole culture of like wanting the internet points, wanting to get retweeted and likes. And the more extreme you sound, you're more likely someone's going to be like riled up and excited about that response. So they're going to retweet it. So then what you end up seeing are the extremes. And again, maybe not all as much of the neutral middle. So just keep that in mind. And this is a related comment. Don't use Twitter to stoke your other negative emotions. Try to think about what you want to feed in terms of your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors. All right, just briefly, as I was wrapping up working on this talk, I was trying to think about like what has come my way professionally as a result of Twitter. And I was shocked by how many things came up. And I think there's more that I didn't even put on here. But because of connections with people that I've made on Twitter, I've had opportunities to collaborate on new research ideas. I've been invited to research symposia. I've been invited to do a podcast. I mean, I've even had people try and talk to me at conferences about job opportunities. And believe it or not, this webinar came about because of some work that I did on Twitter. So I feel very fortunate that my experiences on Twitter have allowed me to connect with lots of people, to have, to feel less isolated, all the other things that I've talked about. And then the icing on the cake is that it's actually helped my career. So instead of downshifting, I'm getting more engaged and connected. All right, so that is pretty much the content that I wanted to cover today. Here is a quick list of the tweeple that I've cited today. And I really am open to answering any questions that people may have at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Billick. We're now going to begin answering any questions on today's presentation. As a reminder, you can type in your questions through the chat box in your attendee control panel. All right.
All right, so one question we're getting is, are there any tips or advice for proper social media etiquette when contacting professionals? That's a great question. I mean, Twitter is a very short, you have to be brief. You have 280 characters. So this is not a formal letter that you're writing someone. If you're reaching out of the blue, I think it's okay to be somewhat direct, while certainly being polite. So if I wanted to reach out to Raul Pacheco, I might just send him a tweet and say, at Raul Pacheco, love your work on academic writing, or probably hashtag #ActRi. I'm curious if you could send me toward any resources on how to write a dissertation proposal. Let's say that was my question. So be respectful, certainly, but I don't think you want to be overly formal because it's not a formal medium. And I think you don't want to be overly ingratiating because, that's sort of feeding the imposter syndrome a little bit, that these are your equals and everyone deserves to be given career advice. So don't be rude, I guess, is all I have to say about that. Anything else?
Yes, we have another question.
Oh, how do you differentiate between having imposter syndrome regarding your work and just having anxiety over your work? Okay, that's another good question. I guess my answer is it doesn't matter. Maybe that's a cop-out, but essentially, if the behaviors that you want to use to fight back are the same, it's okay. Imposter syndrome maybe is just another subcategory of general anxiety about things with regard to your career. So I wouldn't worry too much about which one it is, and I would just think about like, what is the function of my behavior? If I'm avoiding something about my work, it's because, maybe I feel like a fraud, or maybe I feel like I don't know this well enough, or maybe whatever the case may be. And then think about, so like, what's the opposite behavior I could engage in? What are more helpful thoughts that I could feed myself rather than going down that rabbit hole?
All right. Thank you, Emily. We have another question.
Would it be appropriate to ask for a professional's email address through a direct message? I think so. I mean, I can't promise you that they will give it. Oftentimes, you can find people's email addresses ahead of time, but just like through their website or whatever. So sometimes I look for professionals' email addresses that way. But I actually think it's awesome if you already have a connection with them on Twitter, or if you follow them on Twitter, to give them a heads up and say, look, I'm really interested in asking you a question about something. I'm going to send you an email if that's all right. Or if you don't have their email address, saying, like, can you send me the best way to contact you so that I can follow up in this regard? I think that's completely appropriate and helpful in many ways to give someone a heads up, because lots of times, especially if you are pursuing someone who is really far along in their career, I think what I find more and more is that the more senior someone is, the more emails they get, and the harder it is for them to manage their inbox. So it could just be a drop in the bucket if it's not prefaced by a direct message. So I think that that's actually a really good strategy.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Billick, and thank you to our participants for attending today's training. In about 1 hour, you will receive an email that includes an evaluation of today's presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. The email will also include a link to view a recording of this webinar. We invite you to view the many memberships benefits that ADAA has to offer. ADAA members enjoy year-long access to continuing education programs, free access to special interest groups, promotion of your practice in ADAA's online Find a Therapist, significant discount to ADAA's annual 4-day conference, website listings of your clinical trials, support groups, and publications, free online access to depression and anxiety, ADAA's official research journal, networking and collaborating with experts and colleagues from around the world, and much more. Please visit ADAA to learn more. We would also like to invite you to save the date for ADAA's annual conference on March 28th to March 31st in Chicago next year. On behalf of ADAA and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.